All right, everybody, welcome back to CHRTC 203, the Sociology of Christianity. All right, so in this lecture, we're going to look at another one of Stark's arguments, and this one in particular about what he calls the missions to the Jews and why he thinks it probably succeeded. And basically here, Stark is looking to overturn, in a sense, the argument that, whatever Christianity's successes were, it was not successful in converting a lot of Jews. That basically it became a Gentile movement, to non-Jews, but the Jews were unconvinced by Christian claims and never really converted. And Stark thinks that's wrong. He actually thinks there's a lot of good evidence to say that a lot of Jews converted to Christianity for a lot of really interesting reasons. So let's have a look at that argument. So this chapter of Stark's argument about the rise of Christianity is probably him at his revisionist best. It's a really kind of intriguing argument that he makes that basically, what's often been taken as self-evident by historians, that, the Christians found most of their appeal among the Gentiles and failed to really appeal to, the Jews, not only in Israel or in Judea, but also, the diaspora living in other parts of the empire. And what Stark is going to say is that actually their mission probably succeeded to a much greater extent than most historians would acknowledge. Okay, so to put a few things in context in terms of the early church and where Judaism sits at this point. Basically not too long after the death of Jesus, right, in about the year 66, the Jews start a huge revolt against Roman rule. And this is, basically a rebellion. It's led by, a Messiah figure in Judea, basically pushing back against Roman rule. And they briefly sort of win some victories over the Romans and push them back. And then Emperor Titus comes down with the full force of the Roman legions to sort of put to an end the Jewish problem forever. So they fight the war, basically for a 6-year period from about 66 to 73. And against the might of the Roman legions, the Judean rebels are absolutely no match. They eventually, hole up in the city of Jerusalem, and the Romans besiege the city, but the city is, sacked completely. So the Romans break down the gates. The Romans are very good at siege works. They break down the gates. They get into the city. They slaughter the populace, and they burn most of the city. And specifically the second temple, the temple, that was built to replace the temple of Solomon that had been destroyed by the Babylonians. The Romans, sack the temple and they destroy it completely, like they rip it apart. And this is, a huge traumatic event for the Jews to this day. The temple after this point, the place where God is supposed to dwell on earth is destroyed, never to return, right? It does not come back. It's never rebuilt, and at today, a mosque sits on the site of the Temple Mount, the dome on the rock, the Al-Ashra Mosque, I think it's called. So it's never been rebuilt, and it probably never will be. Basically, what had been happening in Judea, there was a fairly thriving Christian community in Judea, and it was sort of the heart of the church, right? It was where James, the brother of Jesus, or the cousin of Jesus, depending on how you read the terms, was, it was the seat of kind of where the first purported church council was in Jerusalem. Now, James is killed in about the year 60, basically in a kind of moment between Roman governors. The Jewish authorities take the opportunity to have him stoned to death. And then after the destruction of Jerusalem, the church essentially disappears from Palestine. What remains is no longer really an important kind of church in terms of it has no authority. The authority broadly shifts to the church in other places, Antioch, Corinth, Ephesus is a major center, and then Rome. So yeah, I mean, basically you get the sack of the temple, or of the city of Jerusalem, and the destruction of the temple in 70 CE. And then, basically you have a Jewish diaspora that spread all over the empire, but it no longer has this kind of gathering point. In the Roman Empire, though, and especially in the eastern part of the Mediterranean basin, from basically Alexandria, in the south, all the way up through Anatolia, modern day Turkey through Antioch and Ephesus, um, there was a considerable Jewish diaspora. Now, this Jewish diaspora is broadly Hellenized, right? Meaning that they are sort of accultured in a more Greek way. Broadly speaking, they speak Greek rather than Aramaic or Hebrew, to the point where, they had to have come up with their own translation of the Old Testament, which is called the Septuagint. And many of the early kind of copies of the Bible actually come out of the Septuagint rather than the Hebrew originals. But they're spread out, they're in a lot of the major cities. There's a big Jewish community in Rome as well, in the Jewish quarter, which has a sort of love-hate relationship with the Romans at the best of times. And they're kind of spread out in different parts of the Mediterranean basin. Now, so what Stark contends, and this sort of makes sense, is that these communities were probably the source of a lot of Christian converts well into the 4th century. And that's the argument that he's going to lay out in this part of the book. So one of the things that's always been true of Judaism, particularly in its more orthodox forms, is that it is an extremely demanding religion and one that often puts people sharply at odds with the rest of society, right? Where basically they, frequently have trouble integrating with other parts of society because, they're expected to keep certain dietary laws, which can often be very strict, right? I know, like, my mom taught at a Jewish school, when she was just starting. She's not Jewish, but she taught at a Jewish school when she was starting her teaching career. And, she had to have a special kind of room where she and the other Gentile teachers could eat lunch because, Jews and Gentiles were not allowed to eat together. They couldn't mix dairy and meat. So cheese on a sandwich meant she was unclean, which meant, she couldn't be around the Jews. They couldn't touch any food that had been, prepared by her. Like all sorts of really strict dietary laws, and keeping kosher remains, kind of a strain on Jews who want to keep kosher, and it's difficult. So what you tend to get is, according to Stark, is broadly speaking, movements within Judaism that try to make it possible for Judaism and Jews to more fully integrate into society and cast off some of the restrictions, right? Like no working on the Sabbath, dietary restrictions, and circumcision. So you saw this, say, in the 19th century with Reformed Judaism, basically, which was trying to do Judaism but without all of these kind of cumbersome rules, allowing, people in, say, the United States or 19th century Germany to still be Jewish, but more fully integrated into society, right? So that they could go and have a BLT, but still say that they were Jewish at the end of the day. Okay, so what Stark says is, like the Jews of the 19th century that want to be more integrated with European society and therefore don't want all of these cumbersome rules, we can assume that a lot of Hellenized Jews still had strong cultural ties and faith ties to Judaism, but probably not living in Judea, wanted much more interaction with Roman society, right? They wanted to be less ghettoized and less restricted from a bunch of parts of Roman society in terms of food, in terms of interactions, in terms of intermarriage potentially, all these sorts of things. So basically, Stark puts 3 propositions forward that he thinks give us a compelling argument to think that a lot of Jews would have seen Christianity as an attractive alternative to Judaism. Okay, so proposition 1. Basically, is that most new religious movements draw their converts from the ranks of the religiously inactive, the discontented, or those, affiliated with more worldly communities, right? So that basically, people who might have a kind of a faith perspective but are not very happy or not very active, they're not deeply ingrained with the practices of the religion, or affiliated with more of the kind of liberal communities. And this, he says, is well proven by the sociological literature on new religious movements. Okay. People are more willing, in Proposition 2, to adopt a new religion if it resembles the religion that they're already familiar with, right? So he gives the example here of Christianity and Mormonism, right? So Mormonism is essentially, Christianity sort of, plus the Book of Mormon, right? With some different kind of teachings from Joseph Smith. But basically it retains the core Christian story, the Old Testament, New Testament, and then adds the Book of Mormon and a bunch of new, other kind of things around that. So what Stark says is, what you see typically is more conversions from Christianity to Mormonism because you're not required to basically cast off your Christianity to become a Mormon, right? You kind of add something to your Christianity. It's more like a bonus kind of on Christianity. I'm not endorsing Mormonism here by any stretch of the imagination. It's like better Christianity. It's like Christianity plus. No, I'm not saying that at all. But it's basically like, if we want to be a little bit glib about it, that's basically what it is, right? It's Christianity plus the Book of Mormon, making it, you don't have to reject Christianity in order to become Mormon. Okay, he thinks that that's true for Jews that would have wanted to convert to Christianity as well, right? That at the end of the day, in order to become Christian, you don't need to cast off your Judaism. You just need to add this other book, right? The New Testament, and this new guy, Jesus, who's somehow God. So it's attractive in that sense. And then, Proposition 3 is that new religions tend to spread much more quickly when they spread through pre-existing social networks. And clearly there is a network of Jewish communities linked to the church in Jerusalem, through that diaspora. So the next argument that Stark makes is basically that, Christianity would have been appealing to Hellenized Jews who were relatively wealthy, educated, but primarily educated in, Greco-Roman culture, and separate from, both Palestinian, Second Temple Judaism, because they didn't speak Hebrew or Aramaic. Most of them had probably never traveled to the temple in Jerusalem, but they're also separate from the Greco-Roman world, right? So because of the dietary laws, because of the things that Judaism demands, ultimately the Hellenized Jews don't really fit in either the Greco-Roman world where they actually live or into the Jewish world. So if a path appears that would give you a way of essentially being part of both, right? That you could keep your Judaism, that you could be Jewish, in a cultural sense, but also find a way to kind of merge that with the Greco-Roman world and give you greater access to the Greco-Roman world, that would fundamentally be quite appealing. Christianity appears, and especially the Pauline version of Christianity, the one that ultimately wins out, that doesn't ask people to get circumcised, to keep kosher, to keep the Sabbath, right? To not do anything, not work on the Sabbath. Fundamentally, Christianity in the ancient world, by opening itself up to the Gentiles, right? So Paul's move of opening it up to the Gentiles, and then, we read in Acts about Peter having a dream where God shows him all the foods that were unclean, and then ultimately God ends up making these foods clean. He says to Peter, it's not what goes in, but what comes out that makes you unclean. That fundamentally this, clearing of the Jewish dietary laws and the things that would have kept you separate from the Greco-Roman world ultimately means Christianity offers a way for the Hellenized Jews to become kind of part of the Greco-Roman world while keeping that Judaism intact with that additional element of Jesus. So they don't have to give up Judaism, right? They just have to accept Jesus as the fulfillment of Judaism, but they can kind of back off of the law, right? They can do things like eat bacon, and why wouldn't you want to eat bacon? Bacon is absolutely 100% the greatest food ever, though it will kill you. So prior to the the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem and the kind of ravaging of the Holy Land by the Romans, it would have been pretty common too for the Jews to receive teachers coming to them from Jerusalem or from other parts of the Holy Land to talk to them about Judaism. And they would have welcomed a lot of these people with open arms. There's a hospitality culture in the ancient world, but in Judaism in particular, that tends to mean that fundamentally, these people would have been welcomed. And so we have good evidence, right, that some of these Jewish communities probably welcomed Paul and Paul's entourage into their communities to hear what he had to say. Now, not all of them liked what he had to say, obviously, because he gets booted out of cities and almost stoned on a couple of occasions, as told in the book of Acts. But you do, at the end of the day, have a receptive community that's used to getting people, especially in the first century, coming to them from Jerusalem. So the early Jewish Christians, Peter, Paul, John, probably found, receptive audiences in the diaspora. So another piece of evidence that Stark takes as dispositive of the fact that Judaism remained an important part of the Christian community in the early centuries is the rejection of what's called a heresy, which is basically a false teaching that crops up in the middle part of the 2nd century, around 144 CE. And this is called the Marcionite heresy or Marcionitism. So Marcion is an early, actually, church bishop, and he's eventually declared a heretic. And what Marcion basically says is almost this very popular thing, and it's something that's cropped up again and again in church history in a lot of ways. But the proposal that, the God of the Old and the God of the New Testaments are fundamentally different. And so this, speaks to the fact that, the God of the Old Testament for a long time has been seen as kind of a nasty figure in a lot of ways, right? The one who is telling the Jews, coming out of the land of Egypt, that they should kill all of the Canaanites, the one who is killing all of the Egyptian firstborn children. It's a harsh God. It's a God of judgment. And in a lot of ways, what Marcion is reacting to is what a lot of modern people react to, is the fact that, this does not seem to line up in a lot of ways with the God that Jesus seems to propose, a God of mercy, and certainly what early Christian theology suggests is that Jesus came down, is God who came down and offered himself up, basically as a way to reconnect humans and God, to do away with sin and to offer grace and mercy to everyone. So this, for early Christians, seemed at odds in some ways with the God of the Old Testament, who seems to offer judgment, tells, people to destroy other nations, and all of this fun stuff. So what Marcion proposes at the end of the day is basically doing away with the Old Testament entirely. That the best way out of this sort of mental problem is to just say, okay, the Old Testament, that was a different God, and Jesus is the true God, so let's just have the New Testament and let's get rid of the Old. So this is rejected by the church. The church fundamentally disagrees with Marcion. Marcion and his followers are cast out. It's declared a heresy by the early church. And Stark takes this, and I think there's good reason to believe that this is actually true, that this was done because Judaism and Jewish communities fundamentally still played an important role in Christianity, in the development of Christianity, that there were probably still people whose relatives, who were Christian, whose relatives were still, over in the synagogue, and that, casting off the Old Testament would have cut those people off. It would have cut Judaism and those people who wanted to stay affiliated with their Jewish identity off from, the early Christian church. So basically, Stark takes this denunciation as important for saying that, basically, the church is still deeply integrated with Judaism. So as late as the end of the 4th century, Stark also notes, and this is true, that the church of this time, and again, this church is starting to become, more integrated with Roman power. It's become the official religion of the Roman Empire. But that bishops start to complain about the fact that there are still Christians that are involved in Jewish kind of communities, in Jewish circles, towards the end of the 4th and beginning of the 5th centuries. So, the 600s. So this is relatively late. This is even, following the collapse of the Roman Empire. And basically what Stark says, and this makes a good bit of sense, bishops aren't likely to complain about the fact that there's too many Christians still involved with Jewish communities if it isn't an actual problem, right? People don't complain about things that aren't happening, right? So basically, Stark says, look, there's clearly still a connection between Judaism and Christianity. There are still Christians who are involved in Jewish communities because at the end of the day, they're still complaining about it, right? The bishops are warning that this has to stop, and they're not going to do that if it's not actually happening. So Judaism does seem to have continued to be important in its ties to Christianity, well into, the 5th century or the 600s, which is a lot later than most people would have put the dating.